Okay. Welcome. This year, the Family Violence Law Center is celebrating Domestic Violence Awareness Month with a political education campaign that is titled Inform Your Vote. This campaign aims to engage voters using a gender-based violence lens while maintaining alignment with our values of survivor agency, racial justice, and economic independence. We also support the work of national domestic violence organizations, and we are all centering humanity, wellness, joy, and connectedness for advocates, survivors, and all who work alongside us towards collective liberation. Today, this discussion around informing your vote, we will be talking about how do you get started? How do you inform your vote? Where can you vote? How do you even register to vote? We'll talk about all of that information and how to get civically engaged. On our agenda today, we'll have an introduction of our speakers. We'll talk about centering ourselves in history, how to get politically activated, understanding why your vote matters, and then we'll offer a conclusion and time for questions and answers. Our first speaker today, Mr. Vince Steele, is a longtime community activist, organizer, and change agent. He served many years with Service Employees International Union, SEIU, as a labor organizer, winning major victories for working class communities, such as Fight for $15, which raised the minimum wage in Los Angeles. Subsequently, Vince managed the organizing and representation departments within SEIU for the teachers and classified employees of the Los Angeles Unified School District. And because Vince had such a love for organizing and politics, he came to the Bay Area where he worked in the nonprofit space, focusing on criminal justice reform and education equity. Vince currently serves as a policy analyst for District 5 of Alameda County. And our other speaker today is myself, Tunisia Owens. I'm the Policy and Advocacy Manager at the Family Violence Law Center, where I have been working for 3 years on changing how survivors of gender-based violence experience social services and homeless services. And I also serve for the youth department of this agency, working with youth in Oakland Unified School District, in San Leandro, and serving other youth in the Bay Area to learn how to have healthy relationships and prevent teen dating violence. So our discussion today begins with us centering the history of voting in the US. When the US started, the 1787 US Constitution, Article 1, gave the states the power to determine who would be included in the electorate. And at that time, it was white, land-owning men. In the 1820s, things started to shift just a little, where the property rights requirement began to be eliminated in various states. In 1870, the 15th Amendment to the US Constitution guaranteed the right to vote to African American men. And in 1920, the 19th Amendment to the US Constitution guaranteed the right to vote for women. In 1924, Native Americans were granted citizenship, but they were not granted federal voting rights. And that is where they started to begin their fight in each state to acquire the right to vote. And in 1962, Utah became the last state to guarantee Native Americans the right to vote. In 1965, the Voting Rights Act was passed, and that act started to protect voters from voter suppression techniques, which had excluded African Americans, Native Americans, and others who were in this country, but were prevented from accessing their rights to citizenship with things like the poll tax, a literacy test, the grandfather clause, and many other techniques that we're starting to see happen again today. And in 2013, a few short years ago, the Shelby County versus Holder decision eliminated the pre-clearance part of the Voting Rights Act. In the pre-clearance part of the Voting Rights Act, states and counties that had a history of preventing voters from accessing the right to vote through poll taxes, literacy tests, and the like, had to get any changes pre-cleared by the US Department of Justice before they made those changes. And so when the Supreme Court held this decision in Shelby County, it actually eliminated so many voters from accessing the right to vote. It prevented so much, there was so much voter suppression that began to happen, again, that it resembled the times before the 1965 Voting Rights Act was passed. Vince.
Thank you so much, Tanisha. I first want to say I'm honored to be here with you all today and to talk about something very near and dear to my heart, voting. By far, one of the most important tools that we have in our community to see real progress and change. But before we get into this conversation, I really want us to understand that voting is just one of the tools that we have. We can organize, community organizing. We have lobbying at our disposal, political, making sure our political officials are held accountable, making sure that we're pushing the right legislation through, volunteering. So there are many components to seeing the conditions of our community change. Voting is one important tool, but it's just one tool. And I want us to understand that we use that tool in conjunction with the many others that we have. Now, we all know this is election season. I've received more flyers from candidates than I can count. Every time I go to my mailbox, there is a flyer, there is a measure, there is someone asking me for their vote. And we're about to see, if you're in Oakland, we're about to see huge leadership change in this city. In fact, we are 32 days away from Election Day on November the 8th. We're going to be electing a new mayor. We're going to be electing new council members and school board directors for districts 2, 4, and 6, and a city auditor. Many of you know, if you've been paying attention and watching the news, that public safety is really a top concern for many voters going into this election. Given the recent rise in violent crimes, unfortunately, Oakland is on track to have one of the highest homicide rates in the last 15 years. On top of that, we've got this affordable housing crisis in the Bay Area, right? Which is leading to the displacement and population decline for our Black and brown communities. On a nationwide scale, if the news couldn't get any worse, what are the economists telling us? They're saying we're headed toward a recession. But you didn't need an economist to tell you that to know that you are paying more for gas, you're paying more for your groceries, right? And you're paying more for your loans. The interest rates are out of control. We're paying more in general as a community, and we're getting less. So I'm a numbers person, and I think numbers tell us a very important story, and we should always pay attention to the research and statistics. The statistics say that less than half of Americans vote, right? So that's between like 45% and 48% of Americans do not vote. In fact, our country is actually among the lowest in all developed nations in the world for voter turnout. And there are many reasons that this research says that, you know, Americans don't vote. This isn't specific to one community, so let's get that out of our head too. This is Americans in general don't vote. Many of us don't vote because we see a lot of chaos, corruption in our politics. Let's be real. We see it on a nationwide scale and we see it locally too. So a lot of us are just not engaged because we don't want to be a part of a system that we feel like is not serving us in the first place. Many of us are just too consumed with life. There's a lot going on. There's a lot of information out there. Folks are just trying to get by, working 2 and 3 jobs, taking care of an elderly family member, taking care of kids, and we're just stretched too thin to really think about voting. And to be honest with you, I work with a lot of community members and a lot of groups. This is what I'm told the most. I'm just not inspired. No one out there inspires me. I'm not driven to want to go and vote. I feel like it's all the same thing. And I understand all of that. I think all of that, that's very valid. In spite of all of that, our vote is still one of the most necessary tools we have to see the change we want to see in our community. And it's really because all politics is local. Let's take schools, for example. Now, if you're in Oakland, you know that there's been this controversy around school closures. Now, I'm not here to talk about whether schools should close or if they should remain open, or that debate is out there, but it's out there because that all connects back to the school board directors we elected to sit on a school board. Those candidates, when they ran, before they were elected, were very clear and open about what their intention was when they sat on the school board. So if we voted or didn't vote, we were telling that person, this is what we want to see in our community, right? And so that's really important to think about. The courts, what about the criminal justice system, the types of judges overseeing the cases in our community? Are we electing liberal judges? Are we electing conservative judges to the court? That's a very important role. The infrastructure, when we talk about infrastructure, we're talking about what? The quality of our bridges, we're talking about the potholes in our street, right? We're talking about graffiti on our buildings, illegal dumping. All of that is the responsibility of your city council member. Again, if you voted or didn't vote, you were sending a clear signal about how you felt around those things in your community. Let's look at housing or lack of housing, to be clear, lack of affordable housing. I hear often that the homelessness situation is out of control. In fact, a brand new report just was dropped the other day stating that homelessness in the Bay Area has rose. So we know that by 22%, we're seeing even more homelessness now, right? What have those politicians done that were there? Have we held them accountable? We know to fix the homelessness issue, we need to build more homes. We need more affordable housing. What bonds, what measures are we voting for or not voting for that dictates how our communities look? Food and gas, what is that? That really has a lot to do with the inflation rates, right? Prices rising. And we're going to talk about this a little bit later, but the Congress people that you send to Washington, D.C. have a lot to do with whether the inflation rates stay, they go up, they go down. They advocate for you back here at home. So we need to be paying attention to that as well. So our vote impacts all of this. And if we move to the next slide, I want to give us another example. All right. So Gregory Ahern, the sheriff/coroner of Alameda County. Greg Ahern served in the dual role of sheriff and coroner since 2007. As you can see on this slide, I'm not going to read each one of the responsibilities of a sheriff, but they have to provide security to the Consolidated Superior Courts. They operate a full-service crime laboratory. They conduct basic academy pursuant to the police office standards and training requirements. Many responsibilities fall under the purview of the sheriff/coroner. Now, this man was sheriff from 2007 to 2022. So that means it took 14 years for someone to finally challenge his seat. He was seeking his 5th district before eventually he lost this year to Yesenia Sanchez, who's the new incoming sheriff, and she won't start until January of 2023. But if you ask any community group, I happened to work at a nonprofit at the time he was sheriff, and any community group in Oakland that was paying attention to what he was doing and how his policies impacted our community will tell you that he was no friend to the community. During that time period, if we go to the next slide, during that time period, we saw many atrocities, 50 in custody deaths at Santa Rita, horrible jail conditions. There were 41 in fact, civil rights lawsuits filed against the county of Alameda. They had to pay out $15.5 million in settlements. Multiple lawsuits against the sheriff's department from peaceful protesters who claimed that they were excessively abused by use of force from his department. Okay, so all of this is important for us to understand. I think what I want us to take away from this is that he ran unopposed for 14 years. So not only do we need to hold our leaders accountable, so if there's no one there to challenge him, we need to put pressure on him, not just the community groups, we need to volunteer, we need to get involved, but we need to stand up and show up to make sure that if someone's harming our community, we are actively trying to find his or her replacement as soon as possible. And Tanisha, I don't know if you may have anything to add to this piece.
Yes, I definitely wanted to include the impact of having a law enforcement agency that does not necessarily work with community groups, particularly those who are victims of sexual abuse and violence. In the case of the Alameda County Sheriff, there was a death when a woman was released from the county jail late at night, and she was raped and murdered because there was no public transportation to get her to safety, and also because the sheriffs monitor transit as well. There was also a lot of sexual harassment and sexual assaults that were occurring on public transportation. And so it's important for those of us who are using a gender-based violence lens to understand that we can actually impact the way that that person conducts their job by recognizing and knowing what they control, what things they have an impact on, how they do their particular work. And so there was pressure put on the sheriff and on that agency to find ways to safely release people from custody so that no one else would have to, die in the cold, and that people are released into housing. They're not released into homelessness from the jail, that there are direct relationships that are being built if someone is in custody. And then also that there is a policy, a rider policy for people to feel safe on public transportation, whether that's the bus or the BART or any public transportation system. We definitely want to hold our leaders accountable. And then again, as we're looking here, there is something, the Alameda County was being used as a detention center for the immigration services, and they would notify ICE when people who were undocumented were being released. And so that relationship is also an uncomfortable relationship, as many of us have family members or friends who may be undocumented, and we want to find better ways to serve those populations.
That's right. That's right. We want a sheriff, more importantly, to come to the table and have a conversation about this with us too. Community groups raised these concerns throughout his entire term. This was not new to him. It was in the media. We put it in his face as much as possible through organized action, and the attitude and the disrespect that we received from him when we tried to let him know our people are dying in the streets. He completely turned his back. So this all has a lot to do with who we're putting in these positions of power. Who has that lever to say, yeah, I can sit down and talk with you, that's no problem, or who is deciding that we're not worthwhile and we're not worth it. And so that, again, we need to have really, really good conversations about who we're putting in these seats.
Exactly. And so for people who, may not have been civically engaged before or may be unaware, there are low barrier ways to get involved. One of the first things that you can do is just start to do a little research. Think about what matters to you. Do you care about the trash in your community? Do you care about pollution? Do you care about the people in your community? Then start to find community meetings that are going on there, because affordable housing is an issue. Then there are tenants' rights meetings and groups that are actively working. When you live in Oakland, clearly there's a homelessness issue. There is a housing crisis. So there are many meetings to talk about how do we challenge the way that we treat people in our community who are unhoused. You can volunteer. I mean, there are many ways to volunteer. There are churches, there are schools, there you can volunteer on phones, on the computer, all of these different ways to really get involved. And you can start to find out who represents you and sign up for alerts. Just watch the news and see what's going on in your community.
Yeah. And in those spaces is where we get together and we share stories and we find out what's happening on the west side, what's happening on the east side, and we start to build community. If we know that Ahern has been there for 7-8 years, maybe we could have caught this a lot earlier. No one has ran against him. We could have put our heads together and found someone in the community to run against him. So it's important that we are always connected and engaging with each other, because there'll be another Ahern at some point. I guarantee that.
Yes, and I think this example of the sheriff who ran unopposed is not unique. There are many places where we have politicians who have been holding on to their seats for a number of years. And so one of the things that you really want to think about is potentially, could you do that job? Can you do that work? I mean, there are different ways to get involved politically, and one of them could be running for office. Yeah. I mean, registering to vote is the beginning of that conversation, but yes, there are many, many ways for a person to get involved.
All right.
And we're gonna play this clip, but Vince, I just wanted, did you want to have anything to say to set up the conversation or why you chose this clip?
Yeah, well, this is my forever president, Barack Obama, y'all. And this clip isn't specifically from 2008. I think this is from his second term. But I want us to play this clip just because I want us to understand not just the importance of voting. I think we've hammered that in enough. But when we start looking at midterm elections and when we start looking at things on the national scale, and when we start understanding that there's a certain amount of votes that we need in the legislation to pass policies through in DC that impact us in Oakland, we're going to get into that conversation. So I want to play this clip to kind of set this up a little bit for us.
Republicans in Congress led, no. Don't boo, vote. That's right. Vote. The Republicans in Congress, led by Congressman Ryan, joined together to block the bill that would have helped states hire and retain more teachers. And as a result, tens of thousands of teachers are not coming back to school this fall. Now, not only is that unfair to our kids, it's foolish for our future. My opponent in this election doesn't seem to understand this. Governor Romney says, we've got enough teachers. We don't need any more. The way he talks about them, it seems as if he thinks these are a bunch of nameless government bureaucrats that we need to cut back on. Those are his words. And his economic plan certainly would do that. The plan Governor Romney has put forward would cut America's investment in education by nearly 20%.
Now, this isn't necessarily about Republicans or Democrats. This is really about understanding the three branches of government and how they work and how they impact us locally, right? And everyone remembers 2008. We might have some young ones on the line. I don't know. I remember 2008. And it was a historical moment, right? There was an energy going back to, I'm not inspired. I don't want to get involved because there's no person out there. Everyone seemed to be, for the most part, inspired by Barack Obama. And, there was a lot going on. We were happy. But what happened 2 years later in the midterm elections in 2010? Democrats lost control of the House of Representatives. Republicans gained 7 seats in the Senate. There was this Republican wave, right? The voter turnout from youth and communities of color that happened in 2008 under Hope, under Inspiration, under all of that, it wasn't the same in 2010. It was as if we decided to vote for him in 2008, turn our backs and just expected he was going to change the world for us, right? And it doesn't work like that. So let's talk about the three branches of government. We have the executive branch, which sort of like carries out or implements the policy for us. And under that executive branch, we have our president and the governor, we've got our mayors, and we have our state and our federal agencies like your FBI and your CIA. And then we have the judicial branch, which evaluates the laws, right? And so the judicial branch, they're making sure that our laws are just and fair. That's the Supreme Court. Those are your judges. Those are also your state and your local courts fall under the judicial branch. Now, the legislative branch is where that Congress I was talking about falls into. And legislative branch, they approve laws and policy, right? And Congress is split up between your House of Representatives and your Senate. Then you have your state legislators, and then you have your city council under the legislative branch as well. Now, in order to get a bill passed, it needs to go through the House of Representatives first, and then the Senate, right? And depending on the type of bill, you may need a 2/3 vote, which is considered a supermajority, or a simple majority, which is just 51%, right? Either way, it's important for either Democrat or Republican, whichever side you're for, it's important to have the majority in these chambers to push policies and laws through that impact our communities. So when we vote in the midterm elections, we're giving Congress people, we're saying, we want you to go and represent us in Washington, D.C. When we don't vote, we're saying the same thing. In fact, when we don't vote, we're giving the other side the opportunity to block progress, right? So I need us to understand that it's not just about voting or not. When we don't vote, we're saying something too when we don't vote, right? We're giving our vote to someone else. We're giving them the permission to speak for us when we don't vote, okay? So Obama ran on hope and change, and guess what? In 2010, he couldn't change anything. We were hoping, but he couldn't change anything because everything he tried to push through was blocked because he didn't have the numbers he needed. So I want to say something. We're in California. This is a blue state, and a blue state means that it, for the most part, leans democratically. So I'm not worried necessarily about California, but many of you, like myself, listen, I got family in the Midwest. I got family in the South. Those are considered swing states. A swing state can be either Democratic or Republican, and the votes really, really matter in those states, right? And so I want to lay this out because just because we're in California doesn't mean that we don't need to. Tanisha talked a lot about volunteering. I'm going to highlight that again. We can volunteer to make calls, to support folks in those states if we have it financially to do, or it can just be a simple call to any family or friends that we have in the South or in the Midwest or those really important swing states, calling them and having them a conversation about who are you going to vote for Congress. We need to make sure that that they understand what's on the line, right? So why am I bringing all this up?
Can I, Vince,
yes.
if I could ask you a question, since you're on this topic, I think that when we look at the judicial branch, which isn't supposed to make policy, but when we look at the recent Dodge decision, which was the abortion, which overturned Roe v. Wade and took away the right for the federal right to an abortion and left it to the states, that now we're seeing the impact of our vote at the national level, like placing it in a historical context. We're in this political moment now where all of those rights that people fought for in the 60s and 70s, now we're looking at that and we have the same fight now, 50 years later. How do we see our vote in California mattering at the national level?
Yeah, no, I thank you for that. It's so critical right now, as we lean into these midterm elections with a new president, President Biden, who, for all intents and purposes, has done a lot of work in these last couple of years. Depending on what side you're on, you may think it's good work or not so good work. But what's at stake, what Tanisha just laid out, not only is a woman's right to choose at stake right now, we have immigration rights. We know that marriage rights will be making its way up to the Supreme Court, right? So we stand to lose all of that if we don't give this president what he needs to push policies through. He's been very clear. He wants to expand the Supreme Court. So when we expand the Supreme Court, what happens? That allows us to get a majority. So maybe some of those policies won't go through. Maybe it won't be as conservative as it is right now, right? And so this gives us an opportunity here at the local level to impact what's going to go on at the Supreme Court. And we cannot lose control of that. Biden has done some things like, for example, all those PPP loans, we got those stimulus checks, right? And what just happened with student debt relief just a couple of weeks ago, right? All of that happened because he had the majority he needed to push those policies through. So you have to think about it that way. We still got work to do on reparations, right? We haven't talked about that. He's got another 2 years to work on that. What about the criminal justice system? What about environmental rights, right? The quality of water. We see what's going on in Mississippi, right? The quality of our air. All of that has to do with what happens at the national level, which then connects to us in terms of who we vote for in Congress, in the House of Representatives. So really, really important that we're paying attention to this midterm election.
And I think I wanted to, this slide is a reminder for those of us in California that we like to present ourselves as this bastion of liberalism, but actually California has a history of voter suppression and exclusion, just like many other states. In 1849, when California joined the Union, there were the only people who could vote were white males who were US citizens and California residents. And California's history of voter discrimination actually included discriminating against formerly enslaved people. California did not want to ratify the 15th Amendment, and actually did not. It took the ratification happening at the federal level for California to be joined in, but California did not originally ratify the 15th Amendment. The Chinese Exclusion Act. So in California's Constitution, Chinese immigrants were not permitted to vote in California, and it said would never be permitted to vote. And Native Americans, again, we had indigenous people and tribes who were in California who were not provided the right to vote. And Native Americans actually had to fight state by state to access the right to vote, including in California. And California did not allow folks who did not own land or people who did not vote regularly at different periods in California's history. They were not allowed to vote, and they were purged from voting rolls. So people registered, and then if they voted once but didn't vote the next time, they were purged from the voting rolls in California. This is not something that happened in Mississippi or in Arkansas or Alabama. This was in California. And then California also required people to make it to the county seat. And so that meant that disabled people were not considered. If you had mobility challenges or it was difficult for you to get to that county seat to place your vote, oh well. So California had a lot to make up for. And now we have, if you are a US citizen and a California resident, you are 18 years old. And if you are not currently serving federal, serving for time for a criminal conviction in a federal prison, state prison, or serving for a felony in a county jail, you can vote. And then those who have been found mentally incompetent to vote are also excluded from voting in California. But this is just to, again, ground us in the history in California so that we apply our gender-based violence lens to what is going on today. And remember that our vote matters because it hasn't always been the case. When California became a state in 1849, women were not included. Black people, not included. And so we want to think about how we really engage in this process as we look at what's going on in our country and what's going on in our state.
Yeah.
So I wanted to ground us again in and get us fired up about being engaged voters. Fannie Lou Hamer is a Black woman who was in Mississippi and was fighting for the right to vote because Black people were excluded. She was a poor Black tenant farmer, and she actually was sterilized by the state of Mississippi because of her status as a poor Black woman. And so Fannie Lou Hamer is a person that fought for the right to vote and fought for the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party to actually represent the state of Mississippi, because over 50% of the population was Black in Mississippi, but was not registered to vote and was prevented from registering to vote. And Fannie Lou Hamer was a person who actually fought to register Black people, poor people, people who had been excluded, started registering them to vote. And so having her as an example, because she was a victim, a survivor of gender-based violence, it was state-sponsored violence. She was sterilized. That is a form of state violence. And so it's important that when we look at her example of leadership, that we are reminded when she says, nobody's free until everybody is free, that is what grounds us in the work that we do. So here we have some examples of voting programs and explanations for special populations. So if, because again, we are looking at gender-based violence, and that includes domestic violence, sexual assault, stalking, human trafficking, all forms of gender-based violence. California has a program called Safe at Home, where you can work with an agency, and the Family Violence Law Center in Oakland is an agency that can register, where you can register to vote and get a safe at home address. And that is an address that would prevent your former abuser from finding out where you live. And so that safe at home address, that confidential address would allow you to receive voting materials and everything. And you can register for one of those. You come to an agency like the Family Violence Law Center and apply for that safe at home address. And then you can get your voting materials. The other special population that we want to consider and think about them knowing about registering to vote and how to access the right to vote are people who have a criminal history. In many other states, you lose the right to vote for life or for a much longer time than the time that you've served in prison. In California, you can register to vote if you have a criminal record, as long as you are not currently serving a state or federal prison term for the conviction of a felony in state prison, federal prison, or a local detention facility. In the state of California, once you have finished serving your term, your right to vote is restored. You simply have to register. It's not based on if you've paid your restitution. It's not based on if you are still on probation. None of those things matter in the state of California. In California, once you have served your time, your right to vote is restored. And then if you are unhoused, if you are an unhoused person, you are still eligible to vote, as long as you have a place that you can receive mail, and that can be a shelter. That can be someone's home that allows you to receive mail there. And then as long as you can properly be assigned a voting precinct. So if you aren't in a shelter, but you can identify a park or near the library or something like that, you can register to vote as an unhoused person. And so it's very important for us to recognize that there are people who have these special considerations and may be unaware that they can register to vote in California, that their voice matters. Vince?
Yeah, I'll jump in with some of these key deadlines coming up. If you want to register, you can do that online or you can do that in person. So if you want to register in person, you can do it during the early voting period, which is October 10th through November 7th. And if you want to find out where in person to register, I don't know if we can pop that link into the chat, but that link right there will take you to a website where you can find out if you're registered or not. Sometimes we got to check our registration status because we moved around, or you can actually register online. If you don't prefer to register online, you can find locations where you can go to in person to register. Voting. So here in California, we do early voting by mail, and ballots are mailed out to every registered voter a few weeks before the election, which means we should be receiving our ballots within the next couple of weeks. If for some reason you don't receive a ballot, and it's the third week of this month, third to fourth week of this month, and you still haven't received a ballot, you need to request a vote by mail ballot no later than November 1st. And once you get that vote by mail ballot, you have to get it postmarked by November 8th to be eligible for election day. All right. Some of us still like to go in person. I'm one of those people that love to go in person and get my sticker. So November 8th, on the day of, polls are open from 7 a.m. to 8 p.m. on election day.
And so before we conclude, I just wanted to, Vince, did anything come up for you as you were talking, or as I was talking around this issue of voting and thinking about what it's like to vote safely, to be able to vote safely, as because again, we are concerned with gender-based violence and with the safety in our cities, with the safety in our county, safety on and who controls safety, which is all of us, right? We all have something to say about safety, and we all want people to safely be able to access the vote. So did anything come up for you, Vince?
I think what really hit me as you were talking through Fannie Lou Hamer, as you were, and I appreciate being grounded in history. I think sometimes we just need to be reminded about the sacrifices and the blood that was spilled before us, right? It's so easy to forget about all of that. And so understanding that so many people have literally lost lives so we can get to this point to vote, I want us to take away the fact that not only do we owe it to our families, our communities, but also our ancestors, right? The folks that came before us, we owe it to them to vote, and not just to vote, to stay engaged, right? Voting is just one step in the process, and I can't reiterate that enough. After we vote, we can't step away. We have to stay engaged. We have to hold those leaders accountable. We need to make sure that if they're not doing what they said they were going to do, using the school board as an example, some folks got on that school board and not doing what they said they were going to do. Guess what? That's what elections are for. You're going to be replaced. So I want us to take that away. I want us to take ownership. A lot of folks, I work in government and I talk to people all the time. There's no trust in government, rightfully so. Government has did a lot of horrible things to communities, state sanctioned violence. And so I need us to remember that we have control over our surroundings, over our communities. We are what we need, and I think we forget that, and we allow other people to make decisions for us. If we are engaged, and there are communities across this country that are super engaged, we can see a difference. So I just want us to take that away and remember that we don't need to lean or count on anyone if we are engaged as a community, and if we continue to build off of the knowledge that's out there.
Vince, I know that you worked a lot on education equity. So one of the things that comes to mind is if you are a legal permanent resident or you are undocumented, but you live in this community, you are part of this community, how do I get engaged? How would someone who was undocumented or someone who was not supposed to vote in elections, how could they get politically activated or politically engaged?
Yeah, I think for our non-citizen community that aren't legally allowed to vote at this point, there's a couple of things that's happening. First of all, we have a non-citizen voting measure that will be on the ballots November 8th. This is specific to Oakland Unified School District, right? So if you're a parent, you're a non-citizen, and you want to have the right to vote, you need to make sure that you volunteer and that you connect with organizations that are promoting this non-citizen voting measure that will be on the ballots November 8th. That's going to allow you, if it passes, to vote in school board elections. Now, that's just one step. We know that our neighboring cities, San Francisco, Richmond, they've already allowed non-citizens to vote in their school board elections. But what this does is it opens the door for us then to make a push for citywide elections, right? And so sometimes you have to start small and then at some point build to other elections where laws can get passed to allow our non-citizens to vote. But at this point, volunteer, look up the non-citizen voting measure in Oakland and make sure that you get that passed on November the 8th.
Okay, well, I want to thank you, everyone who is tuning in and those who might be watching the recording for spending a little time with the Family Violence Law Center and with Vince Steele as we honor Domestic Violence Awareness Month. We hope that you enjoyed this rich discussion that included some history, politics, economics, some political economy and discussion, and that you recognize how important your voice is, whatever your voice might be. And we also hope that you are taking away some important information, namely how and where to register to vote and when you can register to vote. We hope that we have really impressed the point that your vote matters and that you matter. And so your opinion, even if it's not a vote, but your opinion and your voice is an important part of how we move forward as a community and make this place, whether it's Oakland or Alameda County or the state of California, make this a safer place for everyone. And so we thank you for joining us. And that's all. If you'd like to get in contact, my name is Tunisia Owens, and this is my email address, towens@fvlc.org. And Nashi, although you haven't seen her, has been behind the scenes making sure that this is all running smoothly. And she is in Gunasekara at fvlc.org. And we are on all forms of social media. You can look up the Family Violence Law Center and reach out to us and ask questions. Thank you.
Thank you.